Welcome back to D&D Module Monday, the show in which I read a module and then talk about it for however long I see fit. So, today we're talking about Thief's Challenge, and I'm going to get right down to this because I'll be brutally honest with you. I have tried to record this episode twice before and really hated how both of them came out, and eventually, kind of, came to the conclusion that I think these modules are just, this module at least, is just somewhat difficult to talk about in a way that requires that maybe I tackle it a little differently. But anyway, Thieves Challenge is part of a series. I actually have another part of the series here, which is Fighter's Challenge. And there were 4 of these released. There was Fighter's Challenge, Thieves Challenge, Cleric's Challenge, and Wizard's Challenge. They also all got sequels. Each one got a sequel later on, all of which they were all made for 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And the real sort of gimmick to these modules, and I guess gimmick isn't a good way to put it. I guess the sort of the whole point of these modules is that they can be played by one person. Well, technically 2, but they are specifically designed to be played with a dungeon master and just one other person. Now, that's very unique, obviously, for a module. Modules are most typically made for about 4 people, somewhere from 4 to 6. But this one is specifically designed, as all the challenges are, to specifically be played by one player of the class in question. So the purpose of Thief's Challenge is to be played by one player playing as a thief. And the point of these modules was really, well, one, if it was just you and a friend and you still wanted to play D&D, but really these were supposed to act kind of as like introductions, I guess, in a way. So like, say you had an existing game and you wanted to add a player to the game, but you wanted to get them up to speed, whether it be to teach them how to play a little bit or to just get them some experience on a character, you could run these modules for them. So that's kind of where the I don't want to purpose. No, that was the purpose of the modules, but because of the fact that they were designed this way, as you can imagine, they're very, 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 very different modules than what you would normally find. Now, I want to talk about Thief's Challenge specifically because I think it does, at least from what I've read. I don't have Cleric's or Wizard's Challenge. I would like to get it at some point, but I don't currently have it. What I think Thief's Challenge does really well is that it is very much determined by the actions of the player in a way that you wouldn't normally see from other modules. The thing about modules is that they're not railroaded, but they do have to have some sort of, as you can imagine, pretty strict structure to them because they're not that long. They have to get you from point A to point B in fairly succinct fashion. Thief's Challenge, in comparison to many other modules, is very, very open in that respect. I think this module, and I will give you a brief overview as to what's going on. Again, it's a little weird to do, but I will explain how things sort of happen. I think this module is actually very, very, very good for both the player and the DM for 2 very different reasons, and I'll get into that in a moment. But I think most modules are either more fun for the DM or more fun for the players. That doesn't necessarily mean they're bad, but I just think modules tend to be more fun for one or the other. I think Thief's Challenge, in its own way, in the way it's constructed, is very, very good for both the DM and the player. So, to give you a sort of brief backstory as to what's actually going on in this module, all of these modules are formatted the exact same way as far as I can tell. So, like, as you can see here, we have the introduction, the background, the personalities, place of interest, and then the plot points. I believe every single one is formatted like that. I know Fighter's Challenge is also formatted like that, so I would imagine it's a consistent thing. But everything takes place in the lands of Garland, primarily in the lowlands, as you can see here along the river of, I call it like Thadish. That, I don't know how it's pronounced. It's Thadysh, I believe. I don't know. The other areas, such as the Highlands and the Gullwing Hills and the Great Sea, they're not as important. In fact, you actually don't really go to those areas at all. Although you do go to a swamp area. Although that swamp area is also located in the lowlands. So really, you're just in the lowlands. And the story behind this module is that some years ago, in the town of Zadarak, which is up here in the mountains, where you don't really go to, but it is important, had a horrible, terrible ruler that the townsfolk eventually overthrew. Now, the issue with living in Garland was that the river was very, very tumultuous, to the point that it made it difficult for people to cross, to get over. So what they actually did was, in the two towns, you can see them there, Highlock and Whitelock, they installed what the book calls locks. They're more like barges that basically just help to control the flow of the river. So now the river can be traversed by people and merchants and whatnot. And with the new head of Zadarak being a not horrible person, this has kind of settled into a nice sort of community. The one thing that is sort of is that the systems in which people get across the river are basically run by the Thieves Guild, the two Thieves Guilds that have taken up residence in Highlock and Whitelock. Everything was great until recently. It's kind of one of those things with the two Thieves Guilds where it's like, you know, they're illegal, but it's kind of like they're unofficially official, basically. You pay the Thieves Guild to get across the river, or to travel along the river. Now, the sort of basically what has happened now is there is a wily bandit by the name of the Gullwing Bandit who has started raiding ships along the river. And the two Thieves Guilds are basically blaming each other and seeking to use the crisis, to never let a good crisis go to waste, to weaken the other. And it becomes the job of the player to find the Gullwing Bandit, find his identity, so that he might be brought to justice for glory of whichever Thieves Guild he chooses to work with. Okay, that is a pretty basic overview of the story. Now, how this actually plays out is basically the player goes to, and this is kind of the tough thing about talking about this module, there's not specifically like, it's a very, so, the reason I think this module is so good, from a player standpoint, is that much of it is very much determined, as far as how you get through it, by what the player chooses to do. Now, that's important for a few reasons. I think specifically it works really well because you have to remember they're the only player at this table, the only non-DM at this table. Normally, a lot of the fun of D&D is sort of conjured by the players that you're playing with, and considering you don't have any other players to play with, the fact that the player, the one single player, has so much say over the story and how things happen is really, really well done. It gives them something to be interested in. It makes them feel as if their actions are worth something, and generally provides an experience that one would actually want to play. Obviously, the issue with solo D&D is that it gets kind of boring and it's lonely. This is ultimately a game that is really supposed to be played with multiple people. But by making sure the player has so much say over the story, there's multiple endings in this module. They get to choose how they interact with various characters. They get to choose how they go about collecting information. all of this stuff is really left up to them. And it really lets them make their own stamp on this adventure as a party normally would in a more full-fledged module or game. And I think that is really, really great. There is a story, obviously, and there are certain plot points that eventually the player will come up against. But this module effectively really is the player's oyster. And I think that's awesome. And I'll give you a few examples here. Mainly, the one thing is in the places of interest. So we have here personalities, excuse me, in the places of interest. So it mainly takes place in the two towns. It more takes place in Whitelock than Highlock. Though you start in Highlock, the module basically starts with, and I guess I could start this. You basically go to see the captain of the Thieves Guild in Highlock, which is a woman by the name of Mistress Mary Rysick, aka the Mole. And she basically is the one who sends you out and says, go find me the Goldwing Bandit. And from there on, you can basically go about doing that however you see fit. So, that is how it starts. But anyway, you go... What is really done well here... These are just some basic descriptions of the areas. Again, I find it kind of funny that they describe the deserts and the pinnacles and the different places, especially because you don't go to most of them. In fact, it even tells you, like, that the DM should warn against going, like, to the Goldwing Hills. It should be like, yeah, they're really not supposed to go here, so just, if they try to, just tell them to leave, or throw a big monster in front of them that forces them to leave. So I find it kind of interesting that they went through the time to divulge what these places are like. But here, like in Highlock, you have all these different buildings, and you can go to these different places, obviously, which is completely up to the player. And it is their choice of who they choose to converse with, how they go about getting their information, who they might run across, all of which plays a part in ultimately trying to help find and take down the Goldwing Bandit. Now, like I said, most of this takes place in Whitelock, which we have a map of here. Let me make sure you can see that you can. You can see the map there of Whitelock. And, or excuse me, no, I'm totally backwards. Most of it takes place in Highlock. Most of it takes place in Highlock. Yes. My mistake. Let me back up on that. Most of the module takes place in Highlock. I literally said to myself, I was like, that doesn't sound right. Why do they have such similar names? Why are the names of both of them so similar? Okay, so excuse me, let me just, and also just check. I believe the Mole is in Whitelock. Not Highlock. My goodness, I'm so sorry. Why would they name them so... I guess it's a play on the fact that they call them locks. Like Highlock and what... It's stupid. Yes, the Mole is in Whitelock. My apologies. So you start in Whitelock, but then you very quickly go to Highlock. And what you do in either of these towns, as far as the inns, who you converse with, how you get this information, is completely up to the player. For instance, the first real job that the player has to undertake in order to sort of prove their worth, is they have to case the house of a wealthy merchant to basically prove that they are adequate enough to basically try and go after the Goldwing Bandit. And this is the mansion here. Now, what's done in this mansion and what is found by the player is completely up to the player. It is determined by when they go, where they choose to look, what they choose to take, because again, you are, after all, still a thief, and you might be a good guy, but we're in this for the Benjamins. What they choose to take, and how they conduct themselves, and who they align themselves with. Now, what I'll say about this as well is that the plot points, though defined, are largely open in that way. To put it in perspective, when you finish casing the house, people will start to sort of realize that you're pretty good at this. And like I said, if you like this section here, confrontation with Kaima. So if you do a really good job casing the house, this is at the discretion of the DM, I suppose. The woman who went with you, who the mole sent with you, basically to make sure you don't get in trouble, Kaima, will challenge you to a contest of who can take the most valuable item. This will really only happen if the player does a good job. Although it can happen, I guess, no matter what, but it theoretically should happen if the player does a good job. If the player stumbles over themselves and gets thrown in jail, Kaima isn't going to care. Which can happen if you try something that you very obviously shouldn't in the manor. There's guards, there's people around, you can be found out. But, and whether or not you then win this contest by finding an item of higher value than Kaima has a very big impact on what might happen later. Basically, if the player does better than her, she will be none too happy about that. And if you beat her, it might seem great at the time, but she will later come back to try and kill you. After you actually figure out who the bandit is, she will try to kill you because she's a thief, and thieves are mostly in things for themselves. So what the player does and how they choose to do things does impact how this all plays out. There is even, and I'll skip to the back here, multiple endings with the people you meet after you have proof of who the Gullwing Bandit is. Depending on who you bring that proof to, will change the ending. If you bring it back to the mole, who originally sends you out on this quest, if you bring it back to her, she basically says, great job, gives you some money, and you then become like her right-hand man. Cool. If you bring it to the captain of one of the boat ships, who is a noble sort of, a noble person, you get some money, and he will basically, it's kind of weird. You bring it to the captain, but he gives you some money, but then you end up getting a position with the very nice man in Zadarak who I told you about. If you bring it to Kaima, again, she tries to kill you because she wants that proof for herself. If you bring it to the guy whose mansion you cased, because while you're in that mansion, you can basically figure out, if you look closely enough and find the correct documents, you can figure out that he's on the take with a corrupt town guard. And if you know that and bring the proof of him that you know that he's in cahoots with these people, he will pay you hush money. So again, everything that the player does has an influence on this story. And I think that's great because I don't think the story is all that amazing. It's pretty bland. You get sent out, you case the mansion, and then after that you basically talk a bunch until eventually you glean enough information, whether it's from information you find in the mansion, whether it be in areas like the room you want to get into if you want to find some of this really juicy information. You want to get into the office there, which has a bunch of really important information. But basically, whether you get the information from people or these documents and whatnot, you will eventually find your way into the lair of the Gullwing Bandit, where you can obviously then find proof of who he is, mainly through a signet ring that you can find. And then you have the proof, and you can choose how you want to end the module. But it's a little, not a whole lot going on. There is, like, again, if you don't find things out at the like, if you don't find those documents, you can basically steal a hawk and give it to someone, and this is actually much easier than finding some of this stuff. Like, this is kind of like the failsafe. and doing so will get you information about where you need to go and whatnot. Right, I believe that's what it is. Right. Sorry about that. Yeah, anyway, sorry about that. Remember when I mentioned that this is sorry about that. Remember when I mentioned that this module is a little difficult to talk about? Yeah, it's because it's all very loose. It's all very much determined by what the player does. But anyway, however you get the information, whether it's from the mansion, whether it's from there is you can work with the Hylocks Thieves Guild, which is a much more evil thieves guild, by the way. You can work with them to basically come across the information you need. So there are multiple avenues in which you can get what you need, and there's also like a clue system with this man Mish, who is a sage in Hylock. He can basically give you, like it says, to prove the point and save the land, find the loop that fits the hand. That's basically telling you you're looking for a ring. So there, however you get the information, whether it's from casing the mansion, whether it's working with the Hylock Thieves Guild, whether it's working with the sage and the clues and whatnot, there are different ways in which you can get the information you need, but they all lead you to the same point of basically raiding this hideout. I just hit the microphone, I apologize. Of raiding this hideout here and getting the information that you need about the bandit. There's not really much combat in this module, but again, how everything is done is largely determined by the player and who they want to align with and how they want to play. There is a sort of kind of noble way to play this, even though you're a thief. But that is why I think this module, despite the fact that it's a very simplistic story and one that really doesn't have all that much going on, it's how the player gets to navigate it, which I think would be a lot of fun if you're by yourself, that makes this so entertaining. But like I said, eventually you break into this hideout, you get the proof, you give the proof to whoever you want. The player is now a winner in whichever way, or someone tries to kill them, or pay them off, or whatever is done. And that is why ultimately I think this module is really great for the player. Because it just gives them so much to do. They're heartily encouraged to talk with the townsfolk and explore different buildings and generally do things that thieves should do. You should be sneaking around, you should be eavesdropping and trying to get every piece of information that you can and really thinking outside the box, because there's not even really any combat for the most part. There's a few instances in the hideout of the bandit, but there really isn't much combat. There is something if you walk into the swamp, like I mentioned earlier, that you can fight a monster, but again, this is really about the intrigue, talking to people, doing your due diligence about where you should go and how you should go about figuring out how to actually track down this bandit. Sometimes if you're taking a ship, if you choose to go back and forth between Hylock and Whitelock, the bandit might try to jump aboard and obviously raid the ship as he's been doing. That is another way in which the player can sort of learn information if they are part of a ship that gets raided firsthand. So it's just all of this stuff plays into how they choose to complete the module. And then obviously the ultimate choice is left up to them. But I think, again, why this is really fun for the player is that it's so much based around what they choose to do. And I think that's awesome, and you don't really see that in other modules. It also, unfortunately, makes this module a bit difficult to talk about because it's loose, like I said. So I apologize if some of these descriptions are weird, but again, basically you are sent out to basically glean as much information as you can from the interested parties and use that information however you have to track down the bandit and eventually get rewarded for it. That is effectively the premise of the module and the purpose in which the player, and how that is done again is completely up to the player, and that's really cool. I love that, and I think makes what would normally be boring. Normally, you would look at a one player one shot and say that's not very interesting. It makes it very interesting in the way that it gives them some agency. Anyway, now on to why I believe this is so great for the Dungeon Master. Because again, part of the fun for the Dungeon Master is usually having multiple people to interact with and play the game with. So this is a great almost sort of trainer. So what it gives you in Chapter 2 under Personalities is it gives you basically every noteworthy character of name that appears in the module, right? And this plays into the role that the role of the DM is very different in this module in the way that they are almost like a director. They have to direct this movie in accordance with what the player is doing. And as it says here, I'll read this tip from the DM. It is imperative that the DM convey the sense of corruption and mystery cloaking the events of Thief's Challenge. Ideally, the PC should be kept guessing at all times, suspecting that at any moment he may be double-crossed or stabbed in the back. And the way that is done, the way that the DM keeps the player on their toes in that way, is by really understanding what these characters are like and what their interests are. So like I said, the mole is a thief. She's the head of the Thieves Guild, but she's actually chaotic good. And while she is not a very compassionate woman, her ultimate goal is that she just wants to see the Goldwing Bandit caught, because it will let her sort of, it'll let her stop bleeding money from people that now don't want to cross the river because of the attacks. But then you have her right-hand thief, Kaima, who's chaotic neutral. I mentioned Kaima earlier. Kaima's completely bloodthirsty and in this for herself. She wants to be... She's threatened by you. So if the player starts doing well, she's going to do everything she can to basically stop him from doing well. The same thing goes for this thief from the Highlock Guild, Miri Softtouch, who is completely insane, who will just try to murder you. Again, if you bring her the information of the Goldwing Bandit, she just tries to kill you, like Kaima. Hap Ear Farfoot is the head of the Highlock Guild. He's really evil and really terrible, and generally just is out for himself, and he has people on the take. He's all about basically looking out for himself and really wants to get rid of the mole. The mayor in Highlock is completely corrupt, doesn't care about anything. You have to pay a bunch of money to even get to speak to him, and then he doesn't tell you anything. He basically just shoos you away. The captain, like I said, he's like one of the few really good people. But not to go through all these characters, but all of these characters have, in these sections, motivations. And the DM is expected to follow these motivations as to adequately present them within the module to the player, regardless of what the player does. This is a phenomenal, and I mean amazing, just amazing way of really instructing a DM, whether they're experienced or not, of how to play characters and how characters should be played in accordance to their own interests. This is fantastic, because I think sometimes as a DM it is easy to kind of just play as yourself with characters of different names. But really, when you have these different characters with them explicitly laid out as to how they should play, what they're looking to do, the goals that they themselves are looking to achieve, it gives the DM a sort of launch pad to say, this is how you play different characters and make them unique and work them into the world. Like this one, the guy like Nor, this is the Goldwing Bandit. I'll just spoil it. He's the Goldwing Bandit. He is the son of the previous corrupt Duke, who is now trying to basically reclaim his throne. And his motivation, obviously, as you can imagine, is that he's bloodthirsty and wants to get back to royalty and ruling over people. Khan Bardish is the corrupt guard who is working with him, and his motivation is money. If you give him money and whatnot, you can probably talk to him. And but he is pretty tied in with the Gullwing Bandit, so he's hard to talk to. Then you have the wild cards, Trevor Hawks and Lucy Jans. They're basically people who are sort of outside the scope of the module that can just be there for a little fluff. Though they can be helpful and give you advice as far as what you should do. These two characters are kind of the area in which the DM, like, if they think the player might need a hand, they can get a nice piece of advice from Trevor Hawks, who is the man living in the swamps of Garland, or Lucy Jans, who's a bard singing songs. As it says here, motivations. Along with Trevor Hawk, Lucy is the only other NPC the player can trust. She will gladly tell the PC everything she knows for a piece of silver or a merry jig. Right. So, this is what makes this so great for the DM. The basically way in which you can take these characters that are very clearly defined and play very specific roles within the module, and then use that to hone your skills is fantastic. I learned a little bit about DMing just from reading this module, and I haven't even run it. Like, this is something that I would maybe consider doing if I were running a game. I would write out my characters and just write out their motivations, because even just having this stuff on hand makes it so much easier. I mean, think about how easy it is within these contexts, how easy it is to, with everything laid out, to play Lucy, who is one of the only characters the player can trust, in comparison to Kaima. Just think about how more easily you can do that with all this stuff written out. And that is why I think this module is so great for DMs, because not only do they have the fun of sort of reacting to however the player chooses to get through the module, they have the fun of playing as all these different characters that are so clearly defined. And like I said, I think that makes it a very rare module that is pretty much equally fun for the player and the DM. You get to play, the Gullwing Bandit, his sort of cover is that he's like he masquerades as a beggar. And so you get to play this beggar who secretly is the bandit, who the player is looking for. And that is just so awesome to me. And I really do, I don't know. It's funny, for as good as I think, because I think this module hits on so many points that are so good for both the player and the DM in different ways. I don't know if this is something that, like, I would ever say, bring this back. I think D&D is supposed to be played with multiple people. I sincerely believe that. I know some people might say that's not fair. I just think D&D is supposed to be played with multiple people. But the fact that they took this in a way that they took the game from a perspective that I really don't think it's supposed to be played in, made it adequate for created such value for both the DM and the player, for the players to find their fun, and for the DM to have the opportunity to really hone their skills and have something to keep themselves interested in, which is the different ways to play these characters, I think is seriously, seriously impressive. As much as I find it hard to talk about this module, because again, it's so, there's not even much going on. There's not, as far as event encounters, it's all determined by the player. I think the way in which it makes what I think is a very difficult concept for D&D to succeed in, i.e. being one player, the way that it takes that and makes it so interesting for both the player and the DM is awesome. I love it. I don't know if I would ever reprint modules like this or make new modules like this, but it's cool. The way that the players get to find different things in the town. You can find the bandit hideouts, which is in Highlock, which is underneath the tavern, which is where Hap Harfoot and his gang hang out. That's all really, really, really cool. Or excuse me, no, the bandit. Wait, no, the bandit hideout is actually along the river, but I believe you can sort of find it. Uh, you can find the bandit hideout by talking to the correct people, and it's easier talking to people with thieves guilds because, I mean, I believe that's how it worked. But again, it's all just my head is spinning trying to talk about all the different ways that things can come about in this module. I'm so sorry. Like I said, I did not expect this module to be so difficult for me to talk about. So if this video is a rambling mess, I really apologize. But you can go, like, this is neat too. You can go to the barber shop, and there's a barber shop in let me make sure I have it right, in Highlock. In Highlock, and you can get a bunch of information. That's another way the player gets information. There's so many different. It's really like a cat and mouse between the player and the DM. The player gets to choose where they want to go and how they want to get this information. The DM then gets to react to that with the appropriate characters that have been laid out for them. And it's almost like the two players are doing a dance, and it's very unique. And I think it makes this a very interesting module, if one that I find very difficult to talk about. But ultimately, I think Thieves Challenge does a very good job of making something worthwhile of an incredibly difficult premise. The way in which it gives the player so much agency, even if the story isn't great, to sort of go about things how they choose, is awesome. In addition to the way that the DM is given so many cool and unique characters, and the motivations and interests of those characters to play off of what the player is doing is also incredibly cool. So I don't know if I would say Thieves Challenge is like something you should seek out. Maybe it would be cool to have just because it is unique. Like I said, I don't think there are many single player modules, but like I said, it's very cool. And I think this module in a certain respect will go as far as the DM and the player take it, which, you know what, at the end of the day, might just be all you can ask for out of a module. So head out there, explore Thadishan, or Thaddish, whatever. Make some enemies, watch your back, talk to literally everyone. That would be my advice if you were the player. Talk to literally everyone. Get all the information you can, and then make sure you choose your allies wisely. But yeah, I apologize. This was a very weird episode, but I think this module more so should be remembered for how I think it does something difficult well. Then, like I said, there's no grand story here. It's all fairly simplistic, but it is very interesting from a visual standpoint. I mean, this artwork is amazing. I was gonna say, I don't think there's any on the back. The artwork's amazing. The maps are nice. The graphics inside the maps are very readable, actually. Like, these maps are very, very readable. I like these maps a lot. But what little artwork there is nice. I do wish there was a little more, because, like, I mean, this stuff just looks really cool. But yeah, overall, a very interesting module. One that I think does its job very well. And yeah. So, like I said, I can't apologize for this episode enough, but get in there. Like I said, this is what I made of the module, I suppose you could say. A different player might make something completely different because he might go about it a completely different way. Or he'll just get himself killed by Kaima.